Welcome to another special programme here with me, Anne Diamond, at the spectacular Hampton Court Palace, favourite palatial home of King Henry VIII here in southern England, and where they say he spent most of his happiest times. Today, for Viking.TV, I can bring you one of the most fantastic and poignant stories of mother and daughter love. And it's a story that hasn't ever really been told before. Probably one of history's best kept secrets, and it involves two of the most famous women in history, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, mother and daughter, who both lived here from time to time in this amazing palace. This is the setting for a story you'll find intriguing, but which has only just been revealed in a new book. Hampton Court Palace was built over 400 years ago, and it's still one of the most beautiful historic palaces in Europe. Not only a fabulous building, but set in amazing grounds, like this gorgeous Tudor rose garden here. Acres and acres of beautifully designed and painstakingly kept gardens. You only have to look at it from the air to see its lasting majesty. Cardinal Wolsey was Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, and he started building Hampton Court in 1514. Now, his plan was to build a great and grand residence to host King Henry VIII and his court. But Henry liked it so much, he took it over and made it his official royal residence. It had spacious and luxurious apartments for the king and his queen, but also lots of rooms for English courtiers and nobles. It boasted a great hall, that's it behind me, and that's where he hosted huge lavish banquets, galleries of fine art from painters like Holbein, a theatre for entertainment, and sweeping Tudor gardens. During his reign, Henry lived with all 6 of his wives at Hampton Court Palace. It is a house of the happiest memories, but also the saddest woes. His 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, died at Hampton Court after giving him the son he always craved, but who sadly died just a boy of 15. Also, Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was arrested here and later executed for adultery and high treason. It is said her ghost still haunts these halls. After Henry's death, his children, Edward, before his early death, Mary I and Elizabeth I continued to use Hampton Court as a royal residence. But nowadays, when people come here in their thousands every year, it's Anne Boleyn they want to know about. She has to be one of the most famous queens in British history and an extremely controversial figure as the 2nd wife of King Henry VIII. She played a significant role in the English Reformation. By all accounts, in the royal court, Anne was very popular. She wasn't traditionally beautiful by Tudor standards, but she oozed charisma and turned many heads with her lavish French fashions. Eventually, Anne did catch the king's eye. That was in 1522, and it is said he was instantly besotted. Of course, in order to marry her, Henry had to divorce his 1st wife, Catherine of Aragon, and because England at the time was Catholic, that meant divorcing, if you like, England away from Vatican rule, and that was the Reformation. Anne Boleyn visited Hampton Court Palace many times during her courtship, love affair and marriage, and after her marriage to Henry, she moved into the Queen's apartments. They both then made many changes to the palace to celebrate their love by installing both of their initials everywhere. During their marriage, only 1,000 days long, Anne was desperate to give Henry the son he so wanted. But she couldn't produce a male heir. Instead, she gave him a daughter, Elizabeth. Neither she nor Henry would ever know that this little girl would become possibly the most famous queen in all history. And that though mother and daughter never really knew each other for long, they did have a lasting bond. It's a story, as I said, that's never before been told. After he cruelly had Anne beheaded on trumped-up charges of infidelity, Henry had all evidence of Anne removed from this place. She was essentially written out of the history books, and her name literally chiselled off the walls. Fortunately, as we will learn, not every piece of Anne was removed. If you look closely in Hampton Court Palace, there are some rare symbols of Anne Boleyn that have been left untouched, and her daughter never forgot her either. It's an amazing story, and it gets even more extraordinary with the book just written by my special guest today, author and co-curator of Hampton Court Palace, Tracy Borman. Well, Tracy, I've read your book and it's not what I expected from it at all. I was quite surprised by what you'd found out about the relationship between Anne and Elizabeth. It really surprised me and upset me at times. Well, did it surprise you when you started to find out?
It did. I wanted to write this book for many years because I knew a bit about Anne and Elizabeth's relationship, but always sensed that there was a lot more beneath the surface. Even so, I didn't know if there was going to be enough for a book. I didn't know what I'd find out. So it was so surprising, endlessly fascinating. And I'm pleased you said about it being moving, because that's how I found it, doing the research. Because history tells us Elizabeth didn't really think much about her mother, hardly mentions her, end of story. There's so much more to it than that.
And that's what you found out. And it is incredibly poignant, most of it. I know it was 500 years ago and times were different, but it's hard to comprehend the way women were treated. Even highborn women, they were just pawns for men to move around the chessboard, weren't they?
They absolutely were. Women were second-class citizens in the Tudor period, so they were considered inferior in every single respect. Mentally, physically, they couldn't run a country. You know, what on earth was that about? So Anne Boleyn came into this man's world, and she had a very different view. She was quite a radical. She stood out, and she wanted to make a difference as queen, not just be Henry's wife. And I think she certainly passed on some of those ideas to her daughter Elizabeth.
I mean, we know that she ultimately, sadly, was beheaded by her husband. So we have to ask, was Henry VIII an evil person?
I don't think he was evil. I think you sense with Henry that he comes to the throne this very confident, optimistic young man, just 17 years old, and disappointment soon sets in when his first wife doesn't give him a son, and then he becomes more and more disappointed, embittered, paranoid. Now, I'm not excusing the fact he executes 2 of his wives, but I think he's very good at believing his own publicity. He comes to believe that these marriages have offended God and that he has to take action, pretty drastic action.
It was drastic. I mean, he didn't even hang around for Anne's execution, did he? He was off dallying with the next wife.
Already lined up wife number 3, Jane Seymour, whom he was betrothed to a day after Anne Boleyn's execution. That is quite staggering. Henry had an almost pathological ability to move on. He compartmentalised. That was Anne Boleyn. Her story had ended. Now it's time for Jane Seymour.
Yeah, and we're actually sitting in a place where we actually witness that. The fact that this place, this wonderful great hall, was where, when he first was dallying with Anne, still married to Catherine of Aragon, he had the place decked out with little symbols that were H and A, and
yes.
They meant, it was about their love.
Absolutely, and we still see a couple of the H and A's around, and also Anne's falcon emblem, painted over black. It would have been white when she was in her heyday, but you still see quite a few of those in the ceiling. So Henry always decorated his palaces in honour of his latest wife, but you can't blame his carpenters for struggling to keep up at times.
I wonder if any of them left some of them around deliberately.
Deliberately, I wonder.
It would have been a dangerous thing to do, actually, wouldn't it?
Yes, you'd have to be sure that Henry wouldn't see it. He wanted no reminder of the last wife once the next one was in place.
And he just moved on. I'd love him to know that it was his daughter, not a son. That he always wanted a son, but one of his daughters became possibly the greatest queen we've ever seen. I'd love him to know that, wouldn't you?
Oh, I would so love him to know that. It's my favourite irony in history. He goes to all this trouble for a son, tries for 30 years, marries 3 women before at least he has a son, and then actually he needn't have bothered with any of that. He could have just had faith in his youngest daughter, Elizabeth, who would go on to be the glory of his dynasty.
Absolutely. Well, you start your book with the story of the Chequers Ring, which I'd never heard of before. Tell us about the Chequers Ring. What is it? Where has it been all this time, and what does it signify?
So it's called the Chequers Ring because it's at the Prime Minister's country residence, Chequers House. And it's a gorgeous, tiny, tiny ring. A locket ring, and it opens to reveal a portrait of Anne Boleyn and one of Elizabeth, and it was owned by Elizabeth in the 1570s, so when she'd been queen for about 20 years. We think it was made for her, but it's typical of how Elizabeth was discreet about her mother. On the face of it, it just looks like a normal ring she might wear. It has her initials on it, but she knew what it contained, and she kept that ring with her until the day she died.
So what does that tell you about the young Queen Elizabeth remembering her mother in that important way?
I think this speaks volumes for Elizabeth's approach about Anne Boleyn. She felt deeply about her mother, and she felt this abiding and intense loyalty to Anne. But she was discreet, and she kept her feelings hidden for the most part. Sometimes they break through. So this ring is the perfect symbol of that. Elizabeth knows what it contains, the rest of the court doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, most people, when they look at the history, would think, well, Elizabeth was, only 3 years old when her mother was executed. And you would imagine that, how could she have a bond with her mother?
Yes, you would. So she was actually under 3 years old, but so surely she could have had no memories. But we know that mother and daughter forged a very close bond, unusually close.
Just in those 3 years?
In those 3 years. For a royal relationship, it was unusual, because royal childhood, really, you didn't see your parents. Almost from birth, you'd be packed off to wet nurses and other attendants. But Anne, well, she tried to insist on breastfeeding Elizabeth herself, which was soon stamped down on by Henry. But she kept Elizabeth with her. She had velvet cushions placed next to her throne so that her baby could be with her when she was conducting court business. And I love this quote by one scandalised ambassador who just couldn't believe any of this. He said, "Day and night she will not let this daughter of hers out of her sight." And people didn't know what to do with this. It's not normal behaviour for a queen and her child, particularly a mere daughter. But Anne doted on Elizabeth, and that was a very strong bond both ways.
What do we know of what happened when she was executed? Did Elizabeth know? Where was Elizabeth being brought up at the time?
So Elizabeth was away from court, mostly at Hatfield House, where she'd been sent at the age of just 3 months. She had about 50 attendants. It's so frustrating, because the one thing we don't know is how she was told and when she was told about her mother's execution. But I think what we can work out is that her attendants did it sympathetically, because Elizabeth very soon grew to feel this intense loyalty towards her mother. So if she'd been surrounded by people who were calling Anne the concubine, like everybody else was, then perhaps she would have grown up with a more negative view. She had a very positive view of her mother. This is where Anne Boleyn was very clever, because she had hand-picked the servants who would surround her daughter, and they were all either Boleyn relatives or Boleyn associates. And I think that paid off.
So it must have been cruel news to bear, but it must have been delivered to her, at least in a gentle fashion.
Very sympathetically, I think.
Gosh, and then, of course, she has to face up to the fact that she's got a new mother, as it were,
yes,
in the new Queen, Jane Seymour. Did Elizabeth have relationships with the other queens?
Some more than others. So Jane Seymour, hardly at all. She didn't show any interest in Elizabeth. But the next wife, and I have to say she's my personal favourite, Anne of Cleves, so often dismissed as just the ugly wife, but really she had something about her. And she loved Elizabeth. And she said, you know, it would have been a greater prize to me than being queen to have had Elizabeth as a daughter. And what I love as well is that Anne, when Henry had their marriage annulled, gave her Hever Castle, which was Anne Boleyn's old childhood home. And there's a tantalising prospect that Elizabeth would have visited Anne of Cleves there, and thus been introduced to a big part of her mother's life.
What about those awful charges that we generally feel now are completely trumped up,
Yes.
don't we? These awful charges of infidelity against Anne Boleyn. What would Elizabeth known of those, do you know?
Yeah, so we don't, unfortunately, know much about just how much Elizabeth was aware of those, but the Tudors were pretty brutal in terms of treating children as adults. They believed that a child became an adult at the age of 6.
Crumbs.
So I don't think there would have been much of a filter. I think Elizabeth would have found out that what her mother had been charged with. I absolutely believe none of those charges was correct at all. You know, Anne was not the sort of woman to throw it all away.
No, she was too clever, wasn't she?
She was far too clever. She kept Henry at bay for 7 years. This is not a woman lacking in self-control. So I think they were false charges. And I think Elizabeth made it her business to rehabilitate her mother's reputation.
But she still got to remain loyal to her father.
Yes.
What sort of a relationship did she have with her father?
So she didn't see him very much at all. If you believe what she said in public, she adored him. But of course she would
had
say
to say that in public.
She had to say that in public because nobody's going to question Henry VIII, and he was her right to the throne. So of course she's always praising him. She calls herself the lion's cub and all that kind of language. But I think, again, with Elizabeth, actions speak louder than words. I think it's fascinating that when Henry died and his last wife, Catherine Parr, married again shockingly quickly, that was seen as disrespectful, Elizabeth went to live with her. So she didn't avoid her like the plague, like everybody else was doing, because she'd insulted Henry's memory. Elizabeth actually moved in with her, so I think she didn't have a high opinion of her father.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, as we said at the very beginning, Anne wasn't an idiot. She wasn't simple. She was a very clever woman.
Yes.
And she'd learned a lot at the court of France before she came back to live in London.
Yes.
And it looks as though that intelligence went on to Elizabeth.
Absolutely. Anne was described as being very toward as a child, very precocious, incredible intellect. And I think Elizabeth definitely inherited that. Now, there's always the nature versus nurture debate. Anne didn't have much time to shape Elizabeth's mind, but I think she just gave Elizabeth that in her genes. You know, Elizabeth was incredibly intelligent, very sharp-minded, just like Anne. I love the fact as well, both women were great flirts. They both loved the game of courtly love and liked to sort of keep men in play and use it as a way of asserting their power.
Even though it's said that neither of them were sort of great beauties, at least not by Tudor standards.
No, they weren't. And certainly Anne, all the writers at the time are at pains to say she's not a beauty, she's got dark hair when it's all about fair hair, and her skin is swarthy, you know, she's not pale-skinned. But she has this charisma and this self-confidence, and that's what makes her interesting and irresistible.
Yeah, clearly. Just back to Anne, when she was taken to the Tower, which she knew would be for the final time, she did say, and it's quoted by several people, isn't it? She said she was taken to her old rooms in the Tower,
yes,
and she said, "This is too good for me."
Yes.
Now, a lot of people took that as an admission of guilt of
did.
The charges. How do you explain what she said?
Yeah, I think it wasn't an admission of guilt at all. I think Anne is trying to play the game of flattering Henry, being suddenly, you know, just very submissive, very meek, pleading with him. And you see that in her final speech that she gives from the scaffold, you know, calling him a just and merciful prince. I think this is her chance, as she sees it, to get him to pardon her. Whatever it's going to take, just suddenly play the woman he wanted all along, which is somebody meek and mild, not this feisty woman who had really rubbed up against him as queen. So it's almost too little too late, though, by Anne.
Isn't it said that she kept looking up at the window from the scaffold because she was hoping Henry would be looking out of the window and just at the last minute he would pity her?
That's right. On her walk to the scaffold, she kept looking around her, hoping to see a messenger from the king with a pardon. And I think, actually, he'd promised her her life, because just before her execution, he sent a messenger asking her to have their marriage annulled. I think, why would Anne have agreed to that? She'd got nothing to lose. I think he said to her, if you do this, I'll spare your life. And of course, he had no intention of keeping that promise.
It's stunningly dreadful, isn't it?
It really is. There's no excusing Henry VIII.
No.
Even if he wasn't quite the one-dimensional monster, he was still quite a character.
OK, so now Anne is dead, and Jane Seymour is now Queen number 3. Elizabeth, as you said, didn't particularly have much of a relationship with Jane Seymour, but Jane Seymour did give Henry a son.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people forget that.
They do, don't they? Because we know about Henry VIII's quest for a son and his many marriages, but Jane Seymour's the only one of the 6 wives who succeeds right here at Hampton Court. It's always wonderful to tell a story where it happened. In October 1537, Jane at last gave Henry what he wanted most in this world, and he immediately, of course, was in raptures. He called Edward his precious jewel, and Edward was raised here at Hampton Court, really wrapped in cotton wool. You can imagine how paranoid Henry was about his son's
safety. You can imagine him running around here, though, can't you, as a little boy?
I know.
Although he became a sickly little boy, and that was the problem.
That's it. But only in the last year of his life, he fell ill with measles, and that seems to have weakened his immune system. And then he contracted likely something like tuberculosis and died aged just 15. So the great irony is all that trouble for a son he's only king for 6 years.
Absolutely. But Henry's got 3 children then. He's got Edward, who at the moment is a healthy little boy running around here. He's got Mary, his daughter from Catherine of Aragon. And one would argue it might have been his only really legitimate heir.
Yeah.
And of course he's got Elizabeth from Anne Boleyn. Those 3 children knew each other and were brought up sometimes together?
Yes, Elizabeth spent time with both of her half-siblings. She was quite close to Edward. I think they were closer in age anyway, and they were both raised in this new reformed religion that became known as Protestantism. Mary was, I think, to her credit, very kind to Elizabeth. If you think Mary's got every reason to hate Elizabeth, given that their mothers were such enemies. But I think she feels sorry for this motherless little sister of hers. It all goes wrong once Mary's queen. They don't get on quite so well then. But in childhood, yes, they were pretty close.
Yeah. So, I mean, what sort of little girl was Elizabeth? Do we know much about her as a child?
Well, we know she was very precocious. So the one thing we do know about the impact of Anne Boleyn's execution is Elizabeth immediately notices that people are treating her differently. So she says something along the lines of, how come, well, I'm paraphrasing, but how come everybody's suddenly calling me Lady Elizabeth, not Princess Elizabeth? She notices that her status has changed because, of course, now she's illegitimate. Her parents' marriage was annulled. So she's not even a princess anymore. And she says that aged 2 years and 8 months, which I always think is quite impressive. You know, she's a very clever young woman. Yes. What it's obvious that she also is a survivor. And she's shrewd. And she has this most turbulent, horrific childhood, really, under threat of execution or imprisonment. But she survives. And I think that makes her the great queen that she goes on to become.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that you conclude from everything you've read about her that we always look upon her as the Virgin Queen. She was the queen who chose not to marry because there was no way she was going to endanger the throne or her right to the throne. But you see it more humanly than that, in that perhaps because she watched how cruelly her father treated her mother and subsequent mothers or other queens, you conclude that maybe she grew up with an absolute fear of marriage.
I think so. And there's no doubting that this was personal, not just political, for Elizabeth. Yes, she didn't want anybody else to take away her power, but she became almost hysterical when her ministers pressed her on the issue again and again. And she said, I will never marry for reasons that I will never tell even a twin soul if I had one. So it runs deep for Elizabeth, this fear of marriage. And of course she's got a fear. Her father orders her mother's execution. She sees another stepmother go the same way. There are no positive role models in Elizabeth's early life for marriage and childbirth. So it's a very, very personal decision.
We talk about the fear of marriage being foremost in her mind. She's not going to marry, even if that means the end of her dynasty.
Yeah.
But she did like flirting. She had dalliances, didn't she?
She definitely had dalliances, and in particular with a man named Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. He was really her foremost favourite. And I think genuinely she loved him. They knew each other for 50 years. It was a meeting of minds. But I don't think she ever intended it to go further than that. They were very flirtatious. And when she was conferring a knighthood on him, she shocked everybody who was watching by tickling him on the neck as she was sort of, putting his order around his neck. And apparently she had his rooms moved closer to hers. So, of course, there was gossip. With an unmarried queen, there's always going to be gossip. But I genuinely don't think that was a sexual relationship. I think Elizabeth would not have taken the risk of, an illicit pregnancy, or she certainly had no intention of marrying Dudley or anybody else.
It's as we said earlier about Anne, isn't it? She was just too clever to make that sort of mistake.
My favourite quote of Elizabeth's is, she said, I will have but one mistress here and no master. And I think she meant it. And
apparently she even visited this fear of marriage or hatred of marriage upon her ladies-in-waiting. When they got married, she sort of dismissed them. She didn't like it.
She hated it. And they kept doing it because they knew if they asked her permission to marry, she would say no. So it was a bit of a catch-22 position. I mean, what are they going to do? So they often went ahead, married in secret, always got found out, and then they would be in serious trouble. But I think this is where Elizabeth is slightly unfair, much as I admire her. She expected her ladies to do just as she did.
Yeah. Nevertheless, as you say, there were rumours. There must have been rumours at the time, like there are now, about any well-known person and any royal.
Indeed.
There must have been huge rumours that she obviously always had to live down.
Yes, many rumours. On the one hand, you have her entertaining a whole sequence of lovers. The rumours say she's borne numerous illegitimate children by Robert Dudley and others. To the other extreme, you get the rumour that Elizabeth's really a man, and that the real Elizabeth died in childhood. Her servants daren't tell Henry, so they switched her for the only child nearby who looked anything like her, who happened to be a boy. And then that explains, you see, why Elizabeth never married,
yes.
and also why she was so good as queen, because she was really a man.
Because she was a man. Oh, isn't that awful? Tell us about Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, because Elizabeth had a terrible time politically as well. She had so many things to deal with. And one was this other queen.
Yes, absolutely. The thorn in her side was Mary Queen of Scots. She had a very strong bloodline through to the English throne, so she was a threat to Elizabeth, and she was Catholic. Elizabeth was Protestant. So English Catholics really were behind Mary. They wanted her on the throne. And this rivalry dominated Elizabeth's reign for almost 30 years. But Elizabeth had the upper hand because Mary lost control in Scotland, threw herself on Elizabeth's mercy, and of course Elizabeth wasted no time in imprisoning her here in England.
But never not executing her at that point.
Not at that point, and Elizabeth always avoided it. For years, her counsellors were urging her, put the Queen of Scots to death, she's too dangerous to live. Elizabeth resisted until almost 20 years after Mary had become her prisoner, and then there was such undeniable proof that Mary had been conspiring Elizabeth's assassination that she was left with no choice. But this is when Anne Boleyn comes into Elizabeth's mind again. And I think it's why Elizabeth agonised so much about having Mary executed. She was very aware the last Queen of England, the anointed Queen of England to be executed, was her mother. And she did not want to put somebody else through the same.
No, and it also puts her in jeopardy as well.
Yes.
If you can execute a Queen of England, that's what she was too.
Exactly. It sets quite a dangerous precedent, doesn't it?
But in the end, she did.
She did.
But she didn't execute her at the Tower of London, did she?
No, she didn't. It was up at Fotheringay, where Mary was tried, and in the Midlands. And Elizabeth signed the warrant. And of course, her counsellors took it there immediately before she changed her mind. But then she couldn't believe it when she was told that the execution had happened. She shut herself away in her rooms, and she was haunted by this for the rest of her life. On her own deathbed, she was heard to whisper Mary's name. She was still being tortured by what she'd done.
She was tortured by a lot, actually. She was a tortured character. Again, defying the very easy images we often have.
Yes.
Anne Boleyn being a bit of a strumpet.
Exactly.
You know, and deserving what she got. And Elizabeth being hard.
Yes, very hard, unfeeling, just this caricature of a woman and a queen who is, you know, very mercurial and forthright, but there's a real woman beneath this.
Yes.
And she's vulnerable and she's afraid. And I think so much of that comes from her mother's history.
Well, I was going to say she's still clinging to her mother because she went to a great deal of expense and trouble trying to locate little bits of furniture that Anne Boleyn used to own.
She did. I love that. So when Henry VIII died, his possessions were pretty much divided up between his three children. Of course, Edward gets first choice, then Mary. But Elizabeth doesn't go for the high value items. She goes for anything that was related to her mother, like tapestries that Anne Boleyn had once owned, like the Anne Boleyn cup. It still survives, which has got Anne's beautiful falcon on top of it. Fairly low value items, but Elizabeth cherished them.
Yeah, and that is amazing. There's still a little girl inside her.
Yes.
How was she as she grew older?
So Elizabeth never forgot her mother. She grew more confident as queen, I think. And this is when you see her being more able to really express her loyalty to Anne. So suddenly you see the falcon everywhere, Anne Boleyn's falcon. It decorates Elizabeth's musical instruments, her books. She wears it on, you know, her dresses are embroidered with Anne's emblems. And by now, you know, she feels fully able to be open, I think, about how she feels towards her mother. All the way to the end. I think one of the most telling things that Elizabeth does is to surround herself with her mother's relatives. It's almost impossible to get a job serving Elizabeth unless you're a Boleyn or related to the Boleyns in some way.
How times have changed then.
Indeed.
My goodness, because I mean, she wouldn't have been able to do that earlier.
No, she wouldn't.
It was rumoured that she actually commissioned a biography of her mother.
Yes, that's right, by George Wyatt, towards the end of her reign. He wrote a very complimentary account of the life of Anne Boleyn, and he always hinted that there was some great patron behind it. We don't know for sure if it was Elizabeth.
You haven't found it anywhere?
No, sadly not. There's a draft of it in the British Library, but we just don't know. It would have been in keeping with Elizabeth's style, though, just to subtly fund that, to have commissioned it in the first place.
How did she die?
Elizabeth died, she was actually, by the standards of the day, of a good age. She was almost 70. She died at Richmond Palace, not far from here. It was described as being a defluxion of the throat. So it could be anything. I think she knew she was dying at the beginning of 1603. She moved to Richmond. It was her favourite palace because it was her warmest palace. But then gradually, you see, she stops eating and drinking. She refuses even to go to bed. She just stands up as if almost she's decided to die and she wants to hasten it. She wants to weaken herself. She dies surrounded by her mother's relatives. And in her funeral procession, that falcon is on display. And I'm told as well, if you visit her tomb in Westminster Abbey and peer very closely, you will see a tiny carved falcon on that as well.
Doesn't that tell you a lot?
So much. Right to the very end, she's her mother's daughter.
When you researched this and you found out all of these little pointers to this incredible bond between mother and daughter, it must have, like the hairs on the back of your neck must have stood on end.
Honestly, there's such a danger when you're a historian of looking for things and therefore making things fit what you hope is true. But in this case, there was just so much amazing, rich material. And I did have so many shivers down the spine moment, from looking at that checkers ring to looking through the inventories of Elizabeth's possessions and saying, hang on a minute, that used to be Anne's, and making those connections.
And seeing little falcons everywhere.
Just little falcons, and they spoke volumes, both at the time and 400 years later.
I mean, we're sitting in a place where if you stare up long enough at the ceiling, you see little falcons.
Yes.
What was the falcon? I know it was part of Anne Boleyn's coat of arms.
It was. So she used it from when she was given the title Marchioness of Pembroke. This was prior to her becoming queen. And that's when she started using the falcon. It had been used by her ancestors before then, but not very much. Anne really made it her own, and it was her most famous emblem by far.
Yeah, and as I said, we see them everywhere. In fact, you discovered, or it was discovered and then brought to you,
yes,
a falcon by an antiques expert somewhere in Cornwall.
It's extraordinary. So the falcons that you still see here, if you can peer closely enough, on this ceiling, Henry ordered 150 of them when Anne became queen. We have a detailed description in the building records, so how much, what they measured, what they looked like. And then we thought all of the ones that could be reached had been taken down and destroyed. But then, as you say, one turned up at auction a few years ago, spotted by an expert in Tudor antiques. He bought it for £75. It had been painted black, so it didn't look very special. He had it restored. It showed the gilding underneath. And he brought it here to Hampton Court. I remember I was in this very hall.
I saw the documentary you were in.
And that was real. Yeah. That was me seeing it for the first time. And we did some analysis in our conservation laboratory, and it's been dated to the year 1533, when Anne became queen. It matches exactly the description of the 150, and it's now worth about £250,000.
But it's come back home.
It's come back home. We have it here. We display it, on and off in between doing more conservation work on it. It's a thrill when something like that is discovered, because you think you have everything from the Tudors. They're so well known. And then something like that turns up.
When people read your book, what do you want them to get from it? I told you earlier that I was devastated for both women, but also incredibly impressed by them.
Yes. I think that is the message, as well as obviously just people discovering there was a bond, there was a relationship, because that in itself is often dismissed. but how extraordinary both women were. And Anne Boleyn, we tend to just consider her in relation to Henry VIII and her meteoric rise, her tragic downfall, but there was a lot more to her than that. She was a clever, clever woman. She had ambitions and vision for England, not just for herself. And of course, those ambitions were realised by her daughter, another very clever woman.
Beautiful irony as well, isn't it? You say at the end of the book, Elizabeth's sex had been problematic for her, disastrous for her father, and had sealed her mother's doom. It's ironic then that it had ultimately proved her greatest triumph.
Yes, it was. I think at the beginning of her reign, it was seen by the people of England and the world really as a disaster to have another queen. It was seen as monstrous, as somebody described it, to have a woman bearing rule. By the end of it, by the end of her reign, England had fallen in love with queens. And I think all of Elizabeth's successors, the female successors, had her to thank, all the way up to her namesake, Elizabeth II.
I know, and that's extraordinary too, isn't it? Because there is a link.
Yes, there is a link, a very tangible one. Because before Elizabeth, nobody thought it was a good idea to have a woman on the throne. After her, some of the greatest monarchs were celebrated, were queens, Queen Victoria.
But isn't there a line as well between some of our present royal family and the Boleyns?
Yes, in fact, the Boleyns have a direct bloodline all the way through to the present royals. From Mary Boleyn, so Anne Boleyn's sister. Yeah. You can trace that line directly all the way through to our current King, Charles III.
That's quite something, isn't it?
I love it, that the Boleyns still have a role to play.
That's amazing, really, isn't it? How did you find all this out?
In archives, mostly. So I spent a lot of time in the National Archives in West London, which is a real treasure trove, and also the British Library as well. So looking through, contemporary letters. Some of the most rich sources were the ones that sound the most boring, like account books, like inventories. But that's where you find the most fascinating things.
And then is it a bit like a treasure trail? You find something that's a little bit interesting and you start to delve deeper.
You start to go off, and I went off at all sorts of tangents that I hadn't expected. And it was like weaving a tapestry. All these threads, when taken together, produce something dazzling. Yet on their own, they just seem inconsequential.
And how do you work? Is your office just full of Post-it notes everywhere with little bits? Or do you work on a computer with lots and lots of different files? How do you do it?
It's mainly on computer now. My first ever book, quite a few years ago now, I hand wrote it. I wrote it and then I typed it up, and there was something quite nice about that. Of course, time gets less and less. Now I type it all up, and I write and research as I go. So I'm writing the book from day one. And I find that better because it grows.
But you get the sense of excitement.
You get the sense of excitement, and you can go and rewrite things as you discover new materials. So that's how I tend to do it.
It's lovely when you say, at the end, you say, by resolving to remain a virgin queen, Elizabeth I had brought her father's dynasty to an end, but her mother's bloodline would endure. And that's just what you've said now.
Yes.
Our present royal family have a Boleyn bloodline.
Exactly, and you might say Anne had the last laugh in that respect.
Oh, I love that, don't you?
Yes, I do.
It's like I said to you at the beginning, I wish we could tell Henry how mistaken he was, how cruel he was, but that Anne and Elizabeth had the last laugh, as you say.
I wish we could.
It's a fabulous book.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful story. What's your next one?
So the next one is a very good question because I can tell you it's Tudor and it's also related to Elizabeth, and it's very, very new. So that's as much as I can say, but she is my all-time historical heroine, and I will never tire of researching and writing about Elizabeth. So I'm thrilled to be doing it again.
Oh, well, absolutely brilliant to meet you. Thank you so much for writing it, because it is a wonderful, wonderful story.
Thank you so much.
It's true. That's the best story, isn't it?
They're always the best.
Yeah, they are. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Well, here we are finally in one of my favourite places in Hampton Court Palace, and it's not actually the grandest. This is the Master Carpenter's courtyard, and you can see from the way they present it nowadays, you get the feeling that if Henry VIII or any of his 6 wives or 3 children came here now, they'd actually recognise the place. Well, I hope you've really enjoyed the story that we've had to tell you today. Tracy's book is called Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who changed history. But she's written lots of other books too, and you'll see how you can access them on our Viking.TV page. Until I'm with you again here on Viking.TV, I do hope you're having a great time at home, but also planning happy holidays. From me, Anne Diamond, goodbye for now.